We can employ the creative spark God has placed inside us for any number of purposes. So we've seen a few examples up there. Some of them are trivial, fibre, unless you've got that problem, in which case fibre's an act of God. But I could have shown you others that really aren't so worthy. Could have shown you creativity that's being used to recruit militants to ISIS, for instance, because they're very media savvy, or targeted at helping people cheat on their spouse through the adultery website Ashley Madison and their direct marketing message, life is short, have an affair. In April this year, before its private content became public, Ashley Madison had 36 million members in 46 countries. Late last year, ISIS was estimated to rule largely by terror a third of Iraq and a third of Syria. That's 10 to 12 million people. So human creativity is not only real, it's undeniably powerful, for good and for bad. But we're here because we choose to believe in good. McManus is founder of the Mosaic Faith community in LA. He believes that to create is to be fully human. McManus has lots to say about the creative spirit, and these are some words from his book, The Artisan Soul. He who is the creator God is the creative God, and he created us in his image and likeness. He created us with imagination and curiosity, with the capacity to hope and dream. And he placed within us all the material necessary to live an extraordinary creative life. The proof is that more than anything else, we are a soul. And that soul is the divine material with which we are made to create. The difference, he says, between humans and every other species on this planet is that humans are artists. This is our uniqueness. We were created to create. But somewhere along the way we forgot this. We became convinced we were something less. It is time to become more. So let's talk about us and how we're using that divine creative spark as followers of Jesus. Because as I see it, we are on the side of good, and we're here to promote something that makes a positive difference in the here and now and for eternity. Now, I'm a firm believer that Christians can be effective in any field of creative endeavour, as writers, poets, songwriters, filmmakers, photographers, artists, sculptors, musicians, actors, event managers, sound and lighting technicians, yodelers if we want to. We don't have to hold ourselves back from any of those fields just because we're Christian. We don't have to censor ourselves in our engagement in those fields either. But in the context of this conference, I want to talk about using our creativity for the kingdom of God. I want to talk about using our creativity to help people come to know Jesus so that they feel compelled to live a life devoted to God and lived in the service of others. So if you have it in you to be an award-winning writer or filmmaker, that's great. Do you want to do a switch or you're okay? Okay, cool. So that's cool. If you want to do any of those things, that's really, really good. But what I would say is please also be prepared to dedicate your gifts and your talents to God through your church. And I guess I'm going to put a shout out for the Salvation Army in that. You see, that's what we're about as Salvationists. We're about helping people encounter Jesus and follow him. We're a people with a heart for God and a heart for others. That's us. It's us on Sundays. It's us in our midweek activities. It's us in our interactions with people. It's us in our publications, our social media, our creative media. It's us in our music, our art. It's us, most of all, in our words and our deeds. It's us. Let me tell you about Jesus. Let me show you Jesus. Let me tell you what I have discovered for myself. The power of testimony. That Jesus has the power to transform your life and your world, to bring meaning and purpose and forgiveness, to transform your relationships and your community, to bring hope and healing and restoration, to bring you into the very presence of God. Let me introduce you to Jesus. When I think about our calling, because I really do think that's what it is, our calling to use our creativity to help people connect with God, my mind goes back to the Old Testament tabernacle, and I want to talk a little bit about that this morning, which was the worshipping place of the Israelites while they were wandering in the desert for 40 years after escaping Egypt, and then became the model that was used within the Jewish temple. Because I think that looking at that can help us understand our place in the creative world. So the tabernacle was a movable tent. It was always set up in the middle of the various tribes of Israel. And that was important. It was symbolising that God's intention was to be central to people's lives. God's heart was to be accessible to everyone. You know, he really, I think, wanted to enjoy again the friendship that he had with Adam and Eve back in the garden. So people may have this impression that God is far off and disinterested and, you know, somehow just sitting in judgment. But the tabernacle refutes that because it situates God close to the people he loves. But at the same time, the tabernacle made it really clear that God was not easy to gain access to, not by a long shot. So there were all sorts of restrictions and physical barriers between the Israelites and the Holy of Holies, where God's presence was. Any person could go to the outer court of the tabernacle, provided they'd done what was needed to be considered ritually clean, but only the priests could go into the next part, which was called the holy place, and only the high priest could go into the most special part, which was called the Holy of Holies. And then he could only do that, and it was a he, as well, only he could do it on one day of the whole year, which was the Day of Atonement. So anyone else would die if they tried to go into the Holy of Holies at any time, unless they were a priest. And if the high priest entered, anyone at any time, and if the high priest entered any other day than the Day of Atonement, he would die too. Now there was a thick curtain, a veil, that separated the Holy of Holies from the holy place. And in Hebrew, the word veil means a screen, a divider, or a separator that hides. So what was being hidden? The holy God was being hidden from sinful men and women. So it's an odd thing. Even though the tabernacle sent this message that to God's people that he was with them, and that he cared for them, that he wasn't distant, that same tabernacle amplified the stark truth about the human condition, that we just can't waltz into God's presence, just the way we are. There's a serious problem that has to be sorted if we're ever actually going to come close and enjoy intimacy and relationship with God. And hints to that problem were contained in the one piece of furniture in the Holy of Holies, and it was a wooden box called the Ark of the Covenant. So all the Indiana Jones fans are going, oh, we know about that. Bible teacher Gary DeLashmut, I don't know how you pronounce it, he explains that within the Ark there were three things. The first of these was some manna, which is the food that God provided for the Israelites during their wanderings in the wilderness. If anyone knows the old Keith Green song, so I want to go back to Egypt, where everyone just complained about the food that God was providing. It just wasn't like the cool stuff that we had back in Egypt. This is boring. So this was the food that the Israelites complained about having to eat, and so it was in the ark to symbolise their ungratefulness, their rejection of God's provision for them. Another thing that was in the ark was Aaron's walking stick. And this was a reminder that Moses and his brother Aaron were God's chosen leaders. And that's despite the frequent rebellion of the Israelites against them. So the walking stick was inside the ark to symbolise that the Israelites had rebelled against God's leadership. That's why it was there. And finally, the ark held the 10 Commandments, which summarised God's law. And those who were at Nathan's workshop just recently this morning would remember the story that when Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the first lot of the 10 Commandments, the Israelites were having this sort of impromptu worship session around a golden calf. And at the sight, Moses was just so furious because he'd just been having this great time with God, and then he comes down and sees these people settling for something that's so far removed from that. He was so furious that he threw the 10 Commandments down on the ground and smashed them. So God then made another copy and told Moses to put them in the Ark of the Covenant. So the 10 Commandments in the Ark symbolised the Israelites' disobedience to God's law. So what was in the Ark? The symbols of their rejection of God's provision, rebellion against God's leadership, disobedience to God's law. So in other words, what was inside the Ark was an object lesson that showed the problem of sin that had wedged itself between God and his people. On top of the Ark were 2 angels, and they're called cherubim. They're associated with the banishment of Adam and Eve out of Eden. And so their faces were looking down on the contents of the Ark. And this was a reminder that God was always looking at what the Israelites had done. That even if God wanted to ignore that and enjoy the closeness with his people again, and have them enjoy his closeness, there was actually too much in the way. For a holy and pure and righteous God to just go, oh, don't worry guys, it's fine, disqualifies from being God. Thankfully, there was some good news in the Holy of Holies. There was something called the mercy seat, and that was the lid over the top of the Ark. This lid symbolised God's solution to the problem of sin. As we know, because God is holy, God has to judge sin with death. But because God is also loving, he wanted to find a way to judge the Israelites' sin without punishing them. So he provided a substitute to be killed in their place. So once a year, the high priest would select a goat without any physical defect, and he would lay his hands on the goat's head, and that symbolically transferred the people's guilt for that year onto the goat. And then the goat was killed, and the blood was carried into the Holy of Holies by the high priest, and it was poured onto the mercy seat. So now the cherubim, the angels, were looking down, and they would see the sacrificial death instead of the sins of the people. And to reinforce that message, the high priest would then leave the Holy of Holies, and he'd lay his hands on another goat, which he would then send off into the wilderness. And this action told the people that God's judgment for that year had been sent off because of the sacrificial death of that first goat. Now, all of us here know that this Old Testament system was not a permanent solution to the problem. We know that, and so did the Israelites, because it had to be repeated every year. We also know because even as the Israelites had this happen, they still, as a whole, couldn't come into God's presence. Even immediately after the goat was sent off, they couldn't all rush in to the Holy of Holies and, have a great time with God. Not until Jesus. So if you do have your Bibles and you'd like to turn to Hebrews chapter 9, Hebrews 9, 11 to 14. And I'm reading from the Contemporary English version, and I just want to do a bit of a plug for this version. When it was written to be a translation that is very easily understood by people as they hear it read. So it's sort of like a plain English translation, easy to process, and hopefully doesn't raise a lot of questions in people's minds. It loses some of the poetry of the stuff that we really know and love, perhaps if we've been in the church a long time, but it is quite a clear one to understand. So Hebrews 9, 11 to 14. Christ came as the high priest of the good things that are now here. He also went into a much better tent that wasn't made by humans and that doesn't belong to this world. Then Christ went once for all into the most holy place and freed us from sin forever. He did this by offering his own blood instead of the blood of goats and bulls. Moving on a bit, Christ was sinless, and he offered himself as an eternal and spiritual sacrifice to God. That's why his blood is much more powerful and makes our consciences clear. Now we can serve the living God and no longer do things that lead to death. You see, Jesus, we know this, Jesus had no sin problem of his own, so he could provide the solution to ours. not just for a short time or just for a few people, but forever and for everyone who asks for his forgiveness. Hebrews 10 says we are made holy because Christ obeyed God and offered himself once for all. And that's why Jesus, just before he died, cried out, "It is finished." In other words, the old and temporary sacrificial system was now past its use-by date. And that's why at the very moment Jesus died, we heard about this in the leading of the worship before, that veil in the temple was ripped in two, because humanity was no longer screened off from God, no longer hidden from him, no longer divided from God. No longer was humanity barred from God's presence. We were not hidden from God, and God was not hidden away from us. And the way was open for everyone, for anyone. But again, we all know this. So what is the significance of this in a weekend that's focused on the theme of creativity and with the challenge of finding our place in it? Well, I'd suggest the answer is tied up in a passage from Hebrews 4, if you want to flick back. Hebrews 4, 14 to 16, and this is probably one of my favourite passages at the moment, actually. It says, "We have a great high priest who has gone into heaven, and he is Jesus, the Son of God." And then this is the bit I love. "So whenever we are in need, we should come bravely before the throne of our merciful God. There we will be treated with undeserved kindness, and we will find help." I'd like to think that everyone in this room today would apply their creativity for God's purposes, that we would dedicate our skills and our talents and our passions to help people understand the good news, the great news really, that because of Jesus they can come close to God without shame or fear or rejection, that we would assure people there's no need that they have to hide anymore and that God isn't hidden from them. We have the privilege of helping people understand that their past doesn't have to determine their future, and that the best that we can be without God doesn't even come close to the best we can be with God. There's a lot of books come over my desk, some of dubious quality, but others are good. And there's a new Salvation Army one that came across my desk this week by a UK officer called Melvin Jones, and it's called That Contentious Doctrine. And it refers to the Army's holiness teaching. And in it, Jones notes that the root word used for salvation in the Old Testament is about something wide and spacious, and that allows people to develop without hindrance. That's what salvation meant in the Old Testament. So it presents a picture of moving from a narrow, confined place into a wide and expansive place. From restriction to release. From impediment, not being good enough, to potential, to being amazing. And I really love that description. I'd never heard it before, but it really struck with me, because doesn't it imply that our mission in life is about helping people escape from this horrible, cramped, awful prison of sin and run into this wonderful, open and free place? And it reminded me actually of the ending of of Insurgent, which is the second movie in the Divergent series, where the population of this futuristic Chicago, I understand there are some Chicago references this week, realises that they're not actually trapped by the boundary at the end of the city, which is what they were all thinking, but they can run towards something better. Who's seen the movie, by the way? Yep, cool, excellent. So they can run towards this, and they might have a better life. They might have a life free from factions even. And so they run towards the place and the promise that represents. And I guess, to me, that symbolises this running towards life in all its fullness that Jesus promised. Now, hands up if you've read the books. Okay, so I have to say, the books are so much better. You want to read the books. But for those of us who've read the books, we're now wondering what on earth's going to happen in the next movie, because this whole realisation that this is not the truth, wasn't meant to happen yet. So anyway, so that'll be very interesting to see. And if you did see the movie, maybe you're just one of those critics who looked at it, and we've had this discussion, Lauren and I, in the office, about, no matter how amazing it might be out there, you just run off. You pack food. You take some sunscreen, you take some water. You don't just disappear off, no matter how great. Anyway, I digress. My point is that surely those of us in this room feel a calling to employ our creativity to help people know that there is a free land of salvation, to understand that their future can be dramatically changed by God because He is that powerful. And we also want to use our creativity to celebrate, particularly I think when we come together in some sort of corporate setting, whatever that is, to celebrate that when we come close to God, we know what it means to say that God is kind and loving and full of mercy. We know what it means to be rescued by God. Given a choice and the chance to understand what it means, who in the world doesn't actually want to be close to God? If they understood what that is, who doesn't want that? Who doesn't want to set aside fear and rejection? Who doesn't want to know God's kindness and forgiveness? Who doesn't want to help other people? It's the whole William Booth vision, isn't it? Who doesn't want to help other people move out of this narrow, horrible, confining, trapped life and see them released to be their true and best self? And so, if I can be so bold, I would suggest that the creative place that we're advocating you find yourself in as a result of this weekend is not just a creative place that you or others might think is cool or fun or interesting or fulfilling or praiseworthy or, shock horror, deserving of your great abilities. But that above all else, it's a place where your skills and talents and passion, and this is the fun bit, sometimes combined with the skills and talents and passion of others, actually help people approach God and know salvation. Surely that's the point. So what I'd like you to do is just close your eyes for a moment, and we're going to just dig into that a little bit more. Just think about it. Close your eyes so you don't have to worry about anyone else, but I want you to think for a moment about the difference that Jesus makes in your life. I'd ask you to consider the truth that without Jesus you are cut off from God, so that the most you can ever hope for is some DIY solution for God's absence that's going to wear out. You might make do with rituals or addictions or pleasures or work or other distractions, but you can never experience true intimacy with God. Not without Jesus. Without Jesus, there is absence, not presence. So sit with that just for a few moments. What does life without God's presence feel like to you? What is that place like? Some of you will know straight away. Others here may have been Christians for so long, you actually have to think pretty hard to remember what it feels like to not have God in your life. And that's a great thing. Thank God for it. You might not know it all, actually. You may have been brought up with all of this. And so you're going to have to imagine, what is it like to not have God in your life? Now, this is the important bit. Still with your eyes closed, take a moment to empathise with the plight of those who are still cut off from God. What do you want to say to God about that? What is God saying to you about that? And finally, think about what it means that you are not cut off from God, that you are not confined or imprisoned or hidden behind a veil, but that you've stepped out into a wide and spacious place where anything good is possible. What do you want to say to God about that? Okay, you can open your eyes. If we can truly appreciate what it means for us to be saved, will we devote our creative energies to helping other people know that too? Helping them to know and enjoy the undeserved kindness of God. You see, that's the big picture of what we do as creative people who follow Jesus. The smaller details is the how we'll do it. We might do it as an artist or a songwriter or a worship leader or a preacher or an actor. But the big picture is the what. And the what is that God is calling us to invite people into his presence, not just for 60 minutes or so in a Sunday service, but in every aspect of our lives, which is, of course, our true worship of God. Now, some of you, that's going to mean applying your creativity in warm and positive and inviting ways. Particularly, I suppose, for those who are doing Sunday, platform type of stuff, or part of even the welcome group, when people come in on a Sunday. But for others, it will mean using your art, whatever that might be, to show harsher, less gentle perspectives on our world. But at the end of the day, the ultimate aim is for our creativity to point people to God. Even if it's by causing them to consider the deep heartache and sorrow of a life or a world in which God is still absent, not present. This is why God made you to be a creative person. It wasn't so you could just have a cool time and feel good about yourself. I'm sure that's a bonus. But God made you creative because he doesn't want his invitation to salvation to be boring, And because we're all different, he knows that invitation has to be different to speak to different people. He wants us to be exciting and excited about what we're doing because we believe in it, whatever artistic slant we might employ. And the really good thing is that when you look at the Salvation Army's history, its heritage, that's actually something we're very, very good at. This being excited about and for God. This is in our DNA. So we're not doing something that is odd. We're going to sing in a few moments, but I just wanted to, two other things that are just on my heart briefly today in terms of where I feel, and listening to people lately and some of the stuff we've had on War Cry, the magazine, and just some of the conversations I'm hearing around the place. It seems that at this point God's spirit to the Salvation Army, I feel, is probably saying that we need to focus on two things. And one of those is hospitality. There's been a lot of that written about in War Cry, and I've heard it even just this morning. I think the Salvation Army is calling us to become far more creative in our hospitality. I've heard of people in community ministries who, rather than just having people sit in a line outside an office, are now putting in tables and having people from the church come in and sit with people while they're waiting for an appointment, and having play areas for kids, and they're just becoming warm and inviting places. I'd love to think that our family stores were like that, and some of them are, and that when people come in and we see them buying clothes for teenagers, that we might go to them, what? Have you got teenagers? Would they be interested in a youth group? Actually flinging open the doors and just saying, sometimes we're looking for fishing pools, and we've got all these fishing pools in our backyard. I'd just love to see us become more creative in our hospitality. And then the other thing I think is community. In this postmodern world, it's community that is the hunger that people have. And that's the other thing that we really need to, as a Salvation Army, I think, become much better at. So Sunday is not about concert, it is about community, and we've just got to find better ways to make Sunday about engaging with the person alongside you and welcoming in people who are new, and not about jargon and putting up the veil again. Do you get what I mean? Some of the stuff we do is just still putting this big divider up between God's people and the priest or the music team in a priestly function. So we've really got to get better at that. Anyway, we're going to sing to close the song At the Cross, because it really sums up, I think, a lot of what I've spoken about today. And what I'd invite you to do is to stand, and we're just going to pray before we sing. And I just pray that God is challenging you to be generous with the stuff He's given you, you know, with whatever's in your kit. He's just saying, be generous, you know, give it away, use it. It won't run out, you know, just use it and use it and use it. So let's pray. God, I just thank you for the people here today. I thank you for every one of them, because you're just doing amazing things in their lives, and you've led them here. For whatever reason, over this last few days, you have had them here for a reason. So this morning we want to thank you for the friendship we enjoy with you. Thank you for treating us with undeserved kindness, because you love us, because you adore us, actually. Thank you for making us creative people, not boring, but amazing, incredible. It's exciting. But help us to employ that creativity for your purposes. We don't want to be self-serving with it. We want to serve you. We want to honour you. We want others to know your love and your salvation. Don't ever let us lose sight of how much that costs you and of how much it means to us. Use us to point people to the cross.